Welcome to the Non-Anxious Leader Family Systems Basics. This is the third of a three-part presentation on understanding family process. And we always begin with Kierkegaard's quote, "Lord, help me become more self-differentiated," or "Lord, with your help, I shall become myself." And we understand this is the key to being a non-anxious leader. It enables us to take responsibility for our own goals, to take emotional stands, to be a non-anxious presence, in that we can articulate what we believe, but at the same time stay emotionally connected to others in the system, especially to the resistors. Today, as presentation, we're going to be reminded again that it's process, not content. Fill in the blank with the content. It's always the process that we're worried about. And one of the things that is helpful to understand here is that we don't want to argue content with people. As soon as we get into content, we've forgotten about the process, and that is going to work on the side of homeostasis. That as soon as we deal with content, we have lost the ability to change our input into the system and to initiate positive change. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't back out and stop arguing content and start dealing again with process functions, but just keep that as a reminder when you start to focus on content. You've really already lost the ability to initiate positive change. We're going to focus on 4 topics today: sibling position, diagnosis, symmetry, and survival, and families. And there have been some who have said that sibling position is not as important as Friedman has made it, that perhaps more recent research has said sibling position is not as significant a predictor. It is still a way to help us to understand how people function in their families of origin. And Friedman says on page 54 that the position we occupy in terms of sibling position foreshadows our expectations of others, especially those the opposite as well as the same sex, and our own degree of comfort with our own offspring, and our style of leading in succeeding nuclear groupings. So he talks about different types of examples that might help us. For example, in premarital counseling, if both of the couples are oldest children, there's a potential for a king-queen conflict, because both of them are used to being the oldest sibling in their constellation and kind of calling the shots. In a parent-child situation, an oldest a mother who's an oldest child might be disturbed by the immaturity of her youngest daughter. Oldest are rarely as playful as youngest, and youngest are rarely as super responsible as oldest. So our expectations of what children should be can be influenced by our own position in a sibling constellation. When we're thinking about how to coach a family member not to be thrown off by homeostatic resistance or sabotage, oldest generally have the will to push through that resistance, but they're also often more serious, whereas the youngest can sometimes have the playful qualities that enable them to be paradoxical and playful. And so these are just examples of how sibling position can help us to understand or perhaps how we might respond in particular situations, or why certain people are responding in certain ways within the system, the family system or the church system. Diagnosis, I think we talked about in the idea of family and the identified patient, the problem with diagnosing. And diagnosis stabilizes homeostasis. It makes it more difficult for the system to change and for the diagnosed member to change. Labeling has the effect of destroying a person, decreasing their sense of control, increasing their dependency, and lowering their pain threshold. So by diagnosing people, we make it much more difficult for them to get well. And not only that, it fixes the perception of the rest of the family. It makes it easier for them, for the rest of the family to absolve themselves of responsibility, and it makes everything and everyone more seriously. When we start diagnosing, it makes us all more serious. So Friedman has a rule of thumb that if you catch yourself diagnosing someone else, there is probably something in you that you're trying to hide. As soon as you start diagnosing somebody else, the question to ask is, what is it in me that's causing me to feel this way? What is it in me that I am concerned about? And the amount of diagnosing, or as I believe Stephen Covey likes to say, confessing other people's sins, and the amount of diagnosing or confessing other people's sins in a congregational family is an indication of the anxiety level present in the system. So when we see a lot of diagnosing going on, like so-and-so's got a problem, it is an indication that there is anxiety in the system, and somehow we need to start figuring out how we can detriangle and try to initiate positive change in the system. Symmetry is an interesting concept. I think I tried to get into it a little bit in an earlier presentation, but every cause can produce exactly opposite effects, and every effect could have come from exactly opposite causes, with the result that the more polarized things seem to be in a family, the more likely they are somehow connected. So let me go through some examples that Friedman has in Generation to Generation. These are two different tables on page 60 in Generation to Generation. So these are some examples of how the same cause can lead to opposite effects in family life. So parental investment can promote overachievement or underachievement. When we invest too much in a child, perhaps the child will be an overachiever or an underachiever. An overly strict father can produce an overly strict son when he becomes a father, or one who's too permissive, who goes the other way. Alcoholic parents can produce alcoholic offspring, or offspring who marry alcoholics. Dependency can lead to helplessness or controlling attitudes. Helpless or controlling attitudes. A nice clergy person may be beloved by the congregation or taken advantage by them. Well-defined stands can lead to admiration or revulsion. In either case, if we are self-differentiated, we stick to our guns, so to speak, and we stay non-anxious and stay connected emotionally. Surrendering and taking over are both ways of adapting. So when we talk about adaptive behavior, one is surrendering and the other is over-functioning. And here are examples of an effect that can come from opposite causes. Someone who sleeps a great deal could be depressed or content. A family problem can surface after a business failure or a business success, a job loss or a promotion. An extremely rigid offspring can be produced by an extremely rigid parent or an overly flexible parent. Lack of change can be a byproduct of polarization, that is, emotionally cut off, emotional withdrawal, or too much together, being stuck together emotionally. Ineffective leadership can result from stands that are too authoritarian or too concerned with consensus. So if if somebody says, it's just this way or not, that's usually going to result in an effective leadership. Or if a leader says, we're going to wait until we're all in agreement, that can also result in ineffective leadership. A crisis of faith can develop because of lack of self-examination or over-examination. Chronic means always. Chronic also means never. And so this idea of symmetry is in understanding family process, that we're not so much looking for cause and effect. We're looking for perhaps polarization. We're looking at the idea that perhaps are we at one extreme or the other? Because emotionally healthy families that are reasonably self-differentiated, nobody's totally self-differentiated, but where there's a healthy amount of self-differentiation, operate somewhere in the middle. It's not that there aren't problems, but they're able to address problems, take emotional stands, adapt to situations. And so when we're at either extreme, then we're looking at something that's going on in terms of family process that could possibly be addressed through self-differentiation. And then finally, we are looking at survival in families, and the major factor, Friedman says, that promotes survival in any environment is the same that has led to the evolution of our species since creation, and that's our ability to respond to challenge. And Friedman talks about two different types of environments. Two different types of hostile environments. One is a category 1 where we have no resources to enable us to adapt. So that would be like a fish out of water, where just physically it is not possible to adapt. The second category, which is really most all others, has to do, or the crises in which our own response is a variable in our own survival. So the vast majority of crises in our life are ones in which our own response is a variable in our ability to survive. Friedman gives the example of the Nazi concentration camps, and I know that Viktor Frankl wrote a book all about this, and that the one difference that we know of, that the one variable that had the most difference in survival was whether somebody had purpose and hope. And even in that seemingly hopeless situation, one's response made a difference in their ability to survive. In family systems, our repertoire of responses to crisis represent a crucial variable. And when we have a narrow repertoire, and when we have either or thinking, it results in an attitude of helplessness, of feeling victimized, or having all-out efforts to escape. It's not the same as being adaptive people who are victimized by environments. It's what requires us to take a stand in a way that enables us to work our way through the situation. Adaptive people feel victimized. When adaptive people who don't take their own stand, they're going to feel victimized by the situation. But when we are self-differentiated and when we're able to take an emotional stand and remain a non-anxious presence, we actually contribute to our ability to survive. So, there are lots of hostile environments where it may be extremely difficult to survive. Issues like racism and oppression, even things like plagues and epidemics, or personal issues like miserable marriages or abusive environments. All of those things are hostile environments But even so, our own ability to be self-differentiated enables us, contributes to our ability to survive and even thrive. In family systems, as long as we focus on the toxicity of our relatives' behavior, we fail to realize that a far healthier response is to work on ourselves, to take the plank out of our own eye first, as Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount. So this idea of hostile environments, and sometimes even our churches can be hostile environments, helps us to understand that that is not a reason to not have hope, because our own response is a source of hope. Our own ability to work on our own family of origin, our own inputs into the system, our own ability to be self-differentiated and to be a non-anxious presence, to be able to say I when others are saying you and we, is a source of hope, because it does contribute to our ability to survive and to the system's ability to survive. So when we talk about anxious systems in the church, and we think about all of the small churches that are struggling, even larger churches that are struggling, that are getting anxious, our ability to be self-differentiated is a source of hope. It increases the possibility of survival, and for us to adapt in a healthy way to find new ways to respond to the challenge. So that's what we'll look at in the next session, is how do non-anxious leaders actually function in the congregational family.